When we talk about cloud security, we usually end up focusing on configuration, misconfigured storage, exposed credentials, things like that. But what's showing up in these stories is a little different. It's not just how access is gained, it's how quickly that turns into control. So, in one case, we're looking at a path from a compromised package dependency to full cloud admin in about 72 hours. In others, it's attackers working through developer tools, identity systems, or just getting a user to run a command themselves. Now, none of those are especially exotic on their own, but what's changed is how they connect and how fast they move. So today, we're looking at five recent headlines through a cloud security lens and asking, where do we actually have leverage in these environments once an attacker gets a foothold? I'm Sean McMillan, community manager here at Bishop Fox. I'm joined today by Shad Malloy and Thomas Wilson, both security consultants, also with Bishop Fox, and David Newman, COO at Xcelligent. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Happy to be
Thank
here.
you.
Yeah, Thomas, I love that you have Sonic behind you because this is all about speed. So we're going to speed run this.
Got to go fast.
Absolutely. A lot to cover. So first, let's start with this from ZDNet. Google report, AI is accelerating cloud cyber attacks, and one weak link stands out. This is the idea of a collapsing patch window. And we've been talking about speed a lot recently and speed of attackers. But if the exploit window is collapsing at a rate greater than people can keep up, what does a security program prioritize when patching is essentially no longer fast enough to matter?
So I was at the government and we had, I believe, 90 days for lows, 60 days for mediums, 30 days for highs, and 15s for criticals. And I think it's going to collapse that also. So if I was back at the government now, I would be assuming, let's say cut all those in half, because sure, attackers are speeding up and using cool AI tools to do things. I should be doing that on my side too, right? I should be using some AI agent to do my testing on my fleet and getting those patches deployed and making sure they're not going to break anything and doing the regression testing for me. So I think everyone's looking at one side of the knife and not the other, which is definitely going to cut both ways. And I'll kick it back over to Thomas. I'm interested in hearing what he has.
No, I mean, I think that totally makes sense that the window of time to address issues would go down. I think it depends on what the program is. I've heard that government work goes real slow, but that sounds like a pretty aggressive patching window. And I could imagine it get even shorter. But it's kind of interesting to me because one of the big conversations that happens around internal red teams and other internal penetration tests is you're looking at all these issues in configuration that have nothing to do with vulnerabilities. So oftentimes people will be tracking a huge list of CVEs on their perimeter or internally. And when you exploit something, they'll say, where did that come from? What is this? This isn't tracked by our vulnerability management program. So I think vulnerability management is important, but you got to assume that exploits are going to happen that don't necessarily fall into that window anyway. And you just have to limit the blast radius to look at TTPs of attackers once they're already in your network to make sure that you can adjust if you are compromised in some way, that it's not going to have a huge impact.
Yeah.
You started the questioning with Sean, this idea of the cloud, right? And I think that this isn't a security problem, right? This is a broader kind of scope. If we extend out our teammates in SRE and cloud engineering and even in development and those kinds of things, why can't the things that they value are everything is code and the ephemeral state, this idea of standing up and standing down. And so this idea of there's a static enterprise that needs to be patched and cared for and all those kinds of things, take a different approach to it. And where I see that happening in organizations that are thinking differently is concepts like destroy and redeploy, and so their cycle isn't in, days or weeks or months, it's in hours, right? Hey, this is going, not just because they're security minded, but security has become part of the principles and values that they have for sustainability, availability, resilience. And so, we get a little bit upstream because this is not a security problem. Yes, it's couched that way, probably logically so. The other thing is this point of like, what are we evaluating? Security is all about context, right? Oh, there's a CVSS or a crit, whatever the case may be. What's the relevance to us?
Yeah.
Recently with a client on a tipper, an intelligence tipper that said, "Hey, Stryker was hit by this pretty serious attack. Not pretty serious, very serious.
Yeah.
We got decents getting blown up in the Middle East. What does that mean for us? Does it mean anything for us?" And there's an analysis there that goes far and beyond the vulnerability itself, and it gives us more clarity on what we should focus on and can focus on. So I think that we have this opportunity. And by the way, that analysis that we're doing for the intelligence is all being, accelerated through AI, right? And taking those
Yeah.
CVSS sources, taking different things, taking configurations, and quickly being able to paint a site picture that says, we're going to have a big problem here. Let's prioritize our efforts, because contextually, that's most relevant to this organization.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to my next question, that I feel it's always been this cat and mouse game, with attackers getting better tooling, defenders having to catch up and compensate for that. Do we feel like AI is just the next step of that? Or is that an actual change in that dynamic?
Yeah, it's definitely, as a man of a certain age, about 10 years ago, we had this big machine learning one, and it was very similar to this. Microsoft sped up their patches, and for a while, like, the Microsoft OS was really solid until people like kind of overcame that machine learning process. And,
Yeah.
and I think it just comes in fits and starts. Everyone, kind of assumes it's this linear progress. And let's be honest, the AI attackers are definitely ahead of the edge right now. But there's a lot of like AI socks coming out. There's a lot of just kind of reverse engineering and tooling coming out. And, at some point it'll overcome that. And then, we'll go back to a different, the next cool thing will happen.
Yeah.
This is about speed and velocity, right? Let's take, for a pragmatic example, a gate, right? We know an adversary's TTP. We know what they're going to do. They hit this piece, and then they used to have to go away and redevelop that TP or do TTP or change it. Now what's happening is, boom, it changes on the fly with Agentics and goes around that one. Boom, hits it. So speed and
Right.
velocity is what's happening. Why do we have to have those controls or countermeasures? Why can't they adapt like that, right? Why can't they quickly adapt? Now, no intent here to oversimplify it, but again, it goes back to thinking differently. If we look at what an attacker is doing now, we talked about this a couple podcasts ago, where the Anthropic report showed, we
Oh,
looked at it
right.
and said, hey, this is a run-of-the-mill kill chain attack. They're just doing more of it with smaller humans in the loop, and they're going after some things. Great. Well, the next iteration is things like polymorphic changing to TTPs, attack TTPs, and all that stuff. And I think we gotta move in kind, right? We can't be stuck by our own inertia that keep us maybe from advancing those changes quickly.
Yeah, I genuinely think that in some ways, for a SOC or for a blue team more generally, having access to AI tools is almost in some ways more beneficial than it could be to a hacker, right? For
Yep.
example. But a hacker is going to have less scruples about using it for their ends, and they're going to
Yeah.
adapt to it more quickly than a whole blue team will. Looking at how blue teams have to operate, they have a lot of data that they have to process. And AI is really good at processing data more than anything else, just going through it and looking for indicators of something relevant that you prompt it to give you indicators of. For attackers, it's great to accelerate an attack and learn quickly about a framework that you don't know anything about and guide it to some endpoint. But I think for blue teams, there's genuine value there that they could find in implementing something. What that looks like, I don't know. I feel like something is there. There's something that could be developed from that.
Thomas, there's this theme that I've been beating on now for several months, and it's called breaking the inertia. And so let's just say, we have a high speed, low drag Ginsu operator, blue team folks that are doing this stuff. But what they end up being encumbered by are, well, you want to do that, you want to change a control, there's a change process, right? And our change board meets next week and these kinds of things. So it's not just what they can do with some of these new capabilities, and even if they're thinking differently, but they start to bang into these other processes. Do you see that as a challenge as well as an operator?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly are more limited by process as legitimate white hat red team operators,
I
right?
hope
We
so.
can't
Yeah.
use, yeah, we can't just take a client's data and dump it all into Claude and say, hack this for me, right?
Yeah,
Because that just wouldn't make sense. And it's not good for the companies that we do pen tests for. I think there's certainly limitations, but the hope is kind of that, you know, if we can adapt our process at least somewhat to adapt to what is actually happening out in the world, maybe we can basically keep lockstep with what attackers are doing in combination with our own expertise.
I agree.
One of the super pedantic statements that I always make is pen tests, like pen tests like other pen testers. Like we don't
Mhm.
always use the same tools and techniques and thought patterns as attackers. And some of the best pen testers are people who came from outside of it and just do wildly different things because they're not as constrained in their thoughts.
Totally.
Yeah. This week we also saw from Bleeping Computer glassworm malware. It's 400 plus code repos on GitHub, NPM, VS Code, OpenVSX. This is from researchers at Aikido, Socket, Step Security, and open source malware community that have identified these 433 compromised components.
Yeah. Talk about an exploit that a pen tester wouldn't do.
Yeah, exactly. This is something that it's not just your own organization's speed, but if a developer tool chain can become part of the attack surface, how do
Yeah.
you even begin to model or measure something like that?
I mean, I think this goes back to zero trust. And I know GitHub rolled out some remediations after Shai Hulud. I think that was last October. And
Yeah.
part of it was, kind of human in the loop, two-factor auth, limited tokens, and then limited life for tokens. And yeah, I know some of the older Chrome extensions that were half abandoned, but they had an install base and people just offered them money. Like, I wish I could do that on some tests. Can I call up your developer and be like, I'll give you, $1,000 out of this budget. Just send me over some credentials. They would make my life a lot easier.
Right.
So, like, I think this is a complicated problem just because we're putting all our eggs in one basket. Like, the project no longer just lives on my laptop. It lives, in a internet facing repo.
Yeah. Yeah. And you don't even know you may be running like companies may be running this kind of stuff. If they suspect they are, like what do you even do to mitigate that?
I think in some cases, like with supply chain vulnerabilities, you have to just take a risk, right? At a certain point, you have to say any supply chain could technically be compromised and approve certain tools. When it comes to unapproved tools, if somebody's installing that on their workstation, you just have to assume that the workstation itself can't be trusted. Like Shad said, it's got to be zero trust. A user workstation is not to be trusted. And if you're doing something like installing Notepad++ on your Windows servers, you got to just know, well, occasionally the Notepad++ update servers are going to get compromised and it'll temporarily be a complete risk in the environment. And
Yeah.
there's no real way to completely avoid that risk.
I think we need to revisit some discipline in, configuration change and change release to include feature and product commits. But the other thing is, years ago when I was in the government, modeling and simulation of certain capabilities was all the rage, right? The United States today doesn't test nuclear weapons the way we used to because we can do that with mathematical models and
Right.
different things like that. I feel like we're at a opportunistic place to be able to do some modeling and simulation on compromised repos. Hey, what could this look like? We do that just like
Yeah.
we do malware in sandboxes and doing those kinds of things. Modeling and simulation platforms typically were multi-billion sometimes, depending on what it was, and there were all kinds of people, lots and lots of different things. I think we have different opportunities to test some of it. I would also like to see that opportunity to say, what if we put that closer to a developer that was doing these things? Hey, I just want to see how this unfolds. Because the reality is what a developer values is, speed to market on features, usability and availability of code, automation of everything. So they're thinking about fast and efficient. They're not always thinking about safe.
Yeah.
And so how can we enable those to do that? is modeling and simulation in there that maybe is an emerging kind of way to look at those. I defer to Shad and Thomas for their opinions, but I think it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, it was an interesting thing about modeling the attacker, I guess, is maybe not something that would be great in a simulation, but it's clear that this is potentially Russian related, or at least they're trying to false flag as Russia if they're not actually Russia,
Yeah.
because having the Russian locale installed would be like a dead man switch to turn it off. So I think if you're modeling things around attackers from certain APTs, there's certainly some things that you can do if you know their patterns. Like we know Glassworm isn't new, right? But I think probably just knowing what it was helped us identify it as a community faster. Obviously, we didn't identify it, but we can identify those things more quickly and maybe react a little bit more quickly. Even if 433 seems big, that might be kind of small if we're taking into consideration that people know about Glassworm to begin with.
Yeah.
And I think GitHub and the industry, because I think this is like the third or fourth big one. Like there are some people who are probably just sitting around at those large repository companies thinking like, how can we harden this? Because they don't want to tarnish their brand either.
Yeah. So with something like this, at what point does this kind of move from a developer to a board issue? What we've kind of talked on the more granular level, but how are organizations thinking about this at the top?
I mean, this is my personal rant about it is related, I swear. So like there's
Let's go. Let's go.
Shad hot take coming.
So there's a lot of billion-dollar companies that are built on free open source software. And there's some guy who has 7 hours a month that he puts into maintaining like his like XML parser. And that runs 2/3 of the internet. Nobody knows about it. And people find exploits in those. And we like to hammer the developers. Hey, I found this exploit in your thing. And it's like, okay, but what are we doing as a community to help that guy on his passion project that runs all of our stuff instead of just telling him he writes bad code? You know, so I think at some point people are making code off of free open source and monetizing that kind of instead of just pointing, and I've done it. I will say I have reported the free open source software. Maybe we need to start throwing development hours or, you know, buying people coffees. I believe that's right. Buy me a coffee link at the top of all those repos. I think sometimes at some point, if you're monetizing it, you maybe need to give back. Not me personally.
There's an XKCD comic for you if you haven't seen it, but I suspect you might have.
I think I know the one you mean. With the little block with the guy in
where
Nebraska.
it's like one guy in maintaining this repo that keeps the entire internet propped up.
And I was on an assessment middle of last year, October, November of last year, and the UV, like zip package manager for Python, we found that and we were like, it's brand new. You guys aren't really vulnerable to it. We were talking to the client and we were like, yeah, but the patch is delayed. Python has a fix. And I think Rust had a fix and UV had a fix, but there was some dependency in the middle there that was abandoned. And they're like, yeah, we got to fork this and figure out like there's nobody to fix this one link in the middle. And the client was like, well, what are they going to do? Like
there's one other interesting thing about Glassworm that I just wanted to point out, which is it checked the Solana blockchain, I believe, for its C2 instructions, and it had hard-coded a backup to GitHub or no, Google Drive. And obviously a lot of companies are going to have Google Drive whitelisted, but in terms of dealing with C2s, right? Like if you're talking about a C2 vulnerability, like a payload for a C2 that talks to something like a blockchain, that's a clever way to hide C2 instructions, but why are your internal machines in your network allowed to query the blockchain for Solana to begin with, right? And if you're not a Google shop, why are you allowing your developers to grab things from Google Drive? When we see that as red team operators, we just are like, hey, we can put stuff in Google Drive. What a great way to deliver a payload onto a machine that is not going to be seen, right? So I think it comes back to a lot of the network fundamentals that kind of just we've been talking about for years when it comes to internal security.
I mean, I'm not sure how much more they could do. You know, as an APT, if I, let's say I give Thomas a month, I'm his like engagement manager and I'm making sure he's doing his best work. If I gave him that same thing, access on a network to the Solana blockchain, access to Google Drive, and a pre-compromised like GitHub, I would expect big things. I would expect a meaty report.
Yeah.
Yeah. Easy
I
mode.
think too that, this idea and, fish foxes in the thick of this every day is your question was boards, upper management, those kinds of things. What do we need from them? What do we ask from them? Well, first of all, let's take the boards off the board because boards are not management. They do not solve problems. That's not what they're there to do. But when you look at the management, how are we communicating these kinds of things? How are we communicating these risks? And what are our recommendations? Or do we even have a voice? I'm sure you guys have worked with some organizations where there's great alignment, like, hey, we're doing this and articulate some outcomes, and this is what we're going to do about it. And there's follow through, right? There's other organization that look at it as a tactical activity and they don't have a voice. Use that voice just because they're speaking a different language and they don't understand it or we're not putting it in the right terms. I mean, you guys are doing that day in and day out with clients. I'd be interested in your perspective on, do you feel like a current pen test report or another activity or a threat intelligence report, there's any business context in any of that to say, I now understand the business risk and I'm able to make an informed decision on extra resources for the guy that's putting 7 hours a month at something or something of those things because I understand the consequences.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Like a lot of times I feel like when we're working with a security team and they've got some amount of budget to work with us, and maybe it's a little bit more gray box, a little bit collaborative, it's very clearly like, what do they need to make their organization more secure? And how can we directly demonstrate that business risk by compromising a server that's relevant to that impact? Because once you get DA in a network or something like that, you can go anywhere, but that doesn't mean anything to, the CEO of a company necessarily. They'll say, okay, domain administrator, what is that? Or they'll say domain administrator, great, but could you do anything with that?
Right.
And obviously you could block out all the computers or whatever you want, but it's much better if you can get onto a production database because then people will know this is the like CIA triad completely destroyed for this particular set of data.
Just two things around that. So we do like those architecture assessments and threat modeling for clients. And a lot of that is just sitting at a table and learning about people's business and like how they're thinking about it and what they think is the risk. So I did an on-site assessment at a like coal company in Appalachia one time. And I was kind of going through the report and we had gotten DA and, we had gotten a bunch of like healthcare and financial information. And I was like, I used to do industrial controls and I found your fan controllers for one of your mines. And I could shut those down with the elevators and, kill everybody. And I was like, just moving on to the next one, because to me, it was like, I knew how to handle it. And like the risk officer was like, can you roll that back? And I was like, oh yeah, we can go into it. Yeah, you should.
You didn't, right?
No, but I was like, yeah, that's the threat is, somebody
Yeah.
like me who knows what that industrial controller does
Yeah.
that. And to me, it was just another high finding. And we really spent a little bit of time digging into that. They did fix it. They isolated it.
They're calling it the coal miner's Stuxnet.
Yeah, I was like, yeah, that's like you're the fifth industrial controller that I've seen this year.
All right. Well, let's talk about this next one from the Hacker News. This is UNC 6426 exploits NX, and this is a lot of letters, but NX NPM supply chain attack to gain AWS admin access in 72 hours. So that's a threat actor that leveraged keys stolen following a supply chain compromise of that NX NPM package last year. Basically, if anywhere, can we realistically interrupt a chain like that once identity's been established?
I'm going to roll this back to me supervising Thomas on an assessment.
Yes.
And I'm going to say, if I given credentials, an overscoped account, which is and they added an administrator role, if it took him 72 hours to do that, I might be like, well, come on. Like I've seen those go really quickly. Not by me. I am not a great cloud pen tester. I will admit that. But I have called in like some heavy hitters when I had stuff that I thought was cloud related.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, here, run these 2 PowerShell commands. And I was like, okay, so what am I now? And they're like, oh, you own the tenant. And I was like, oh, okay, that was good. So I think there are people out there who could do that faster. And I'm not challenging them. I'm not saying that they were the worst. I'm just saying
Yeah.
The thick in that kill chain was as they added a new administrator account, and that is a canned query in Google Cloud. Like, pipe that out to an alert notice. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that sort of thing, it's like, we don't know. 72 hours, again, there sometimes, articles like this are a little bit sensational because we don't know the lead up to
Right.
that compromise
What is
necessarily. The
included?
man
Yeah.
hours, right? Yeah, like 72 hours. That's some amount of time. That is the front end of that is a mystery. But I think that once you have an admin in GitHub, there's a GitHub account, right? Yeah, I mean, you're going to be able. You can pull CI/CD stuff. You're probably you've owned
Yeah.
virtually everything in that part of the organization. So if that's the role that they got in with, then it makes sense. They were probably just sitting on that for a little while and waiting for the right moment to do all the actions that they wanted to do before kind of taking
I
over.
love that observation about some things just being sensational, right? I think we got to do a better job. I applaud more transparency in some things that happen. Amazon, not a tiny organization, right? And I think they got more than a couple services and probably a baker's dozen or so worth of customers around the world. So, at what point is that happening? Where in the infrastructure? How is it moving? And then let's have a little bit tighter control on that. Because it's interesting how people look at it. I mean, rock stars are looking at it and go, 72 hours, you suck, right? So others are looking at it and go, oh my God, in 3 days, my world has collapsed. Well, really,
Right.
the whole world or just certain parts of the world that have been exposed? And then what does it take to recover for that? So,
Yeah.
I mean, I know that's not super technically specific, but I don't find a lot of super technically specific things in some of these reports. And quite frankly, unless you're part of that or been a victim of it, you're probably not going to get some of that. And I think we could be probably more transparent on some of these things so we learn these lessons and apply it to everything. When I was a CISO at Rackspace back in the day, we had 300,000 clients and more than a baker's dozen worth of capabilities and hosted environments and a public cloud. So it was not trivial to say, yes, it's this or it's that. But when you have something that's multi-threaded across there, it gets pretty hairy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, speaking of like going from one part of an organization to another, like GitHub to AWS might not seem like a crazy jump, but completely obviously different authentication schemes. They talk to each other, but one of the big problems that you'll see in a bunch of pen tests and a bunch of organizations is, hey, we have an admin here and they have access to credentials to be an admin somewhere else. Taking over GitHub admin is bad, but you don't want taking over GitHub admin to give you credentials to an AWS admin, right? That sort of information shouldn't be stored in GitHub. You should still part and parcel out access based on what CI/CD operations you need to do.
Absolutely.
yeah, I think we should invent something that's where they base your access on your role. I mean, we could probably come up with a cool name around it. I don't
We'll
know.
workshop this. Yeah.
Based role.
I'm all about naming stuff, right? Some really cool name. We got a great up. We need to name more stuff, I think.
So,
Yeah.
All right. We also have from the Hacker News this week, Quick Fix campaigns spread MacSync macOS info stealer via fake AI tool installers. Basically, a social engineering campaign that tricks macOS users into copying and running malicious commands in their own terminal to fix a fake AI tool, bypassing all the OS level protections through user authorized execution. Once again, it's the people. So, where do you put controls in for something like this? I mean, is it another training video or what? How do you handle this?
It's tough, right? You want developers to be smarter than this. It's very clever. It's very clever how they did it by being like a pipe into an installer like that. It's so funny. I genuinely respect the hustle on this particular Quick Fix. It's very good. I like it.
I mean, social engineering, it works. Like I have been on pen tests where I was completely stuck and then just literally asked somebody, hey, can you give me the Wi-Fi password? And people are nice and they want help. And you're like, oh, you shouldn't have done that, but thanks. So,
I think all human beings where these kinds of opportunities for bad guys to socialize should be replaced by really annoying bots that just drive people crazy and do that. It'll frustrate threat actors so much that they'll never want to do social engineering again. Of course, you'll lose all your customers because they'll hate it too. But
Right.
gain loss. I mean,
I mean, this is one of those things like click fix attacks are very handy in social engineering engagements. It's so hard to get a user to interact with them. But if you're not limited by scope, right? Like if you can just shoot out, if you have a whole list of all the employees at a company, it's like maybe like a 50,000 person company,
Yeah.
just send huge chunks at a time to people that you know the titles of. If they're developers and you're doing a pinpointed developer attack like this, it's easy pickings. You'll get, a handful of people who actually.
That's all you need. Yeah.
Right. And I think, like, again, this goes back to zero trust on the workstation, right? You have to assume if you're an individual user, not at an organization, none of this applies to you. Please just don't do this. Your own computer will be ruined. But if you're working at a company and if you're managing a company, right, like users shouldn't have C2 beacons running on their machines be like an end of a world scenario. Like you want it to be that you have endpoint detection that can either react to that, or you have some sort of isolation so that the machine itself can't talk to C2 endpoints. I think that's really kind of the strongest one because a lot of our payloads get past some of the strongest EDR. So it's one of those things, right? Like you just want to make sure that those workstations are extremely locked down and have nothing that they can do, and that you review them and you harden them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we've mentioned this on another one where it's like everyone wants the technical solution, and I want the technical solution, and I want to create it, and I want you to buy it from me. But at the
Make a
same
lot of
time, it's
money.
like not everything is a technical fix. Like sometimes the issue is like maybe tell users, hey, there's a new phishing campaign, and it's not fun, but
yeah.
sometimes you have
Yeah.
to do the least fun part of the
This
job.
is it's a real egg on your face kind of attack. It just,
Mhm.
no one looks good after this.
I'd be like, so I ran a click fix attack. So I have a Mac sitting right here with my hand on it. I ran this click fix attack. Somehow I got thrown against a wall after I realized what I did. So
Finally, we have from Tech News World. Microsoft warns of hackers supercharging cyber attacks with AI. This feels like a headline for just the past year, but new research from Microsoft warns that threat actors have begun integrating AI into their workflows to accelerate tradecraft, bypass safeguards, and conduct malicious activity. We've seen this across the industry so far, but I think it leads to that question of attackers iterating way too fast. What does keeping up mean anymore? Has that changed?
I think kind of no in some ways, just because AI tooling lets people exploit the vulnerabilities that were already there faster. And I think AI defense just helps you identify them yourself faster and identify actors in your network faster, or wherever they may be, vulnerabilities in your products faster. But it's all the same thing. If you're not spending time looking at your own stuff through an attacker's point of view, you're never going to know when it hits you and you're suddenly hacked or compromised in some way.
I go back to Shad's comment, not every security or technology problem requires a security or technology solution, right? Maybe it's just obvious. So when I hear things, are we able to keep up? Keep up to what? Right? Because I think in terms of effects, not necessarily, oh, there's 100 million APT threat actors and doing all this crazy stuff. Okay. But here's what that means to us, and here's what I'm focused on. Am I measuring myself against the right thing? So I think it's more than full circle back to Thomas's point is it's more sensationalism than anything else. Are we keeping up? Depends on what you're measuring yourself by. I think in terms of effects, not competition necessarily,
Yeah.
maybe. If I'm in a boxing match and I throw great punches, but I win the match, right? Because they just landed perfectly. But the other guy threw 80. I know I'm taking
Yeah.
you guys back to a Rocky movie, but you win, am I keeping up? Well, I don't know. I won, so I guess I am.
I mean, kind of what that makes me think is like you were saying, keeping up. Like, why bother keeping up? Because it's like defense can be reactive, but ideally you want it to be very proactive, right? You
Yeah.
want to have taken steps in advance so that when some sort of attack does happen, you can react to it. Because they'll happen eventually. Like, AI is helping people surface these things faster, but people have always surfaced these things at a rate that is hard to keep up with if you're not actually doing the hacking yourself. So you just assume that some things will be out of your control, and you put defensive measures in place to respond to that.
I hope there's like a whole hidden undercurrent here that none of us will ever be privy to, which is somebody is looking at a patch that they're writing for a CVE, and they're like, hey, robot, go check all of our other code bases. And if I wrote this dangling pointer there, tell me about it. We can fix it. So they might fix 1,000, but now it doesn't exist for anybody. So we just never hear about it. So
Yeah.
like my big hope is we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. And then, there's robots out there fixing tons of things that will never be an issue in the future.
You hear about all the ones that go wrong. Yeah. Exactly. All right. Well, I think that we got through that as fast as we can. It was in honor of all this talk about speed and Sonic. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining. If any of you listeners found this useful, share it with someone in your organization that may benefit from it. But until next time, gentlemen, thank you and stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care, guys.